Some call you a diversity champion. To me, you are a hero.
General, I'm just doing my job.
They called her a diversity hire until a four-star general walked in and saluted. Her Lieutenant Colonel Maria Santos endured 2 years of whispered comments about being a diversity hire at the Pentagon, where colleagues assumed her promotion was about politics, not merit. But when General Patricia Hayes, the first female chairman of the Joint Chiefs, walked into the briefing room and immediately stood at attention upon seeing Maria, the room learned the truth about the token officer who had once saved the general's life in Afghanistan and earned the Medal of Honor in a mission so classified that her heroism had been buried for a decade. The Pentagon's E-ring buzzed with its usual controlled chaos as Lieutenant Colonel Maria Santos made her way to Conference Room 3A, carrying a briefing folder that represented months of intelligence analysis on emerging threats in the South China Sea. At 38, Maria moved with the precise bearing of someone who'd spent 15 years proving herself in a military that often questioned her right to be there. As the daughter of Mexican immigrants who'd built a small restaurant business in San Antonio, Maria had fought for every achievement in her military career. West Point Ranger School, multiple combat deployments, and now a coveted position on the Joint Chiefs Strategic Planning Staff. But despite her credentials, she still heard the whispers that followed her through the Pentagon's corridors. Diversity hire, affirmative action promotion, token Latina to check the boxes. The comment stung because Maria knew that no matter how hard she worked or how many achievements she accumulated, there would always be those who attributed her success to her ethnicity and gender rather than her capabilities. This morning's briefing was particularly important. Maria had uncovered intelligence patterns suggesting a coordinated effort by hostile nations to test U.S. response capabilities in multiple theaters simultaneously. Her analysis could influence military strategy for years to come, but she knew that some of the senior officers in the room would be more focused on questioning her conclusions than considering their merit. Santos called out Colonel Bradley Thompson, a career Pentagon insider who'd made his disdain for political correctness in military promotions well known. "Hope you got something more substantial than your usual academic theories." Maria kept her expression neutral, though her jaw tightened slightly. Thompson had been undermining her work since her arrival, always couching his criticism in terms that skirted the edge of acceptable professional discourse. "My analysis is based on verified intelligence from multiple sources," Sir Maria replied evenly. "We'll see," Thompson said with a smirk that suggested he'd already made up his mind. The conference room filled with senior officers, most of whom treated Maria with professional courtesy, while maintaining a subtle distance that reminded her she was still an outsider in their world. She'd learned to read the signs the way conversation stopped when she approached the slight hesitation before including her in informal discussions, the assumption that her opinions carried less weight than those of her male colleagues. As Maria prepared to begin her briefing, she had no idea that her career was about to take a dramatic turn, or that the highest-ranking officer in the U.S. military was about to walk through the door and change everything. Maria was halfway through her presentation on Chinese naval movements when the conference room door opened and a figure that commanded immediate attention entered. General Patricia Hayes, the first woman to serve as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, stepped into the room with the bearing of someone who'd shattered every glass ceiling the military had to offer. The room immediately came to attention, but General Hayes's eyes were fixed on Maria with an expression that seemed to combine recognition, surprise, and something that looked almost like awe. "As you were," General Hayes said, but her gaze never left Maria's face. "Please continue with your briefing, Lieutenant Colonel Santos." Maria felt a flutter of nervousness. Having the chairman of the Joint Chiefs observe her presentation was both an honor and a pressure she hadn't expected. She continued her analysis of Chinese military positioning, but she could feel General Hayes studying her intently. "Lieutenant Colonel," General Hayes interrupted, "forgive me, but have we met before? Your face is very familiar." The question sent a ripple of confusion through the room. Maria felt her heart rate spike as memories she'd tried to bury came flooding back. Afghanistan, 2014, a classified mission that had gone sideways, a young captain who'd been trapped behind enemy lines. "Ma'am," Maria said carefully, "I'm not sure. I've served in several theaters." "Afghanistan," General Hayes said, her voice growing stronger. "Forward Operating Base Chapman, March 15th, 2014. The date hit Maria like a physical blow. She remembered that day with crystal clarity, the day that had earned her the Medal of Honor and nearly cost her everything. But the mission had been so highly classified that the medal had been awarded in a closed ceremony with no public recognition or media coverage. Colonel Thompson looked confused. "General, I'm not sure what—" "Colonel Thompson," General Hayes said, her voice carrying the authority of absolute command, "I need you and everyone else in this room to understand something about Lieutenant Colonel Santos." She moved to stand directly in front of Maria, and to everyone's shock, came to attention and rendered a perfect salute. 10 years ago then, Captain Santos led a rescue mission that saved my life and the lives of 12 other soldiers. She single-handedly held off an enemy assault for 6 hours while calling in airstrikes on her own position to prevent our capture. The silence in the room was deafening. Maria felt tears threatening as the memory of that day came rushing back, the desperate radio calls, the sound of incoming mortars, the decision to risk everything to save soldiers she'd never met. "Ma'am," Maria said quietly, "you don't need to." "Yes, I do," General Hayes interrupted, "because for 10 years I've wondered what happened to the captain who saved my life. I've tried to track down her service record, but the mission was classified so highly that even I couldn't access the files." She turned to address the room. "Gentlemen, you are in the presence of a Medal of Honor recipient. Lieutenant Colonel Santos didn't just serve with distinction, she performed one of the most heroic actions in the history of special operations." Colonel Thompson's face had gone pale. "Medal of Honor, but there's no record." "Because the mission was classified," General Hayes explained. "Captain Santos's heroism was buried in black files to protect operational security. She received her medal in a ceremony attended by exactly 7 people, and she was sworn to secrecy about the details." Maria stood at attention, overwhelmed by the moment. For 10 years, she'd carried the weight of that day in silence, unable to share the story that had defined her military career. "Ma'am," she said to General Hayes, "I was just doing my job." "No," General Hayes replied firmly, "you were being a hero, and it's time everyone knew it." The revelation transformed the atmosphere in the conference room like a lightning strike. Officers who had been politely indifferent to Maria's briefing were now staring at her with a mixture of awe and embarrassment. Colonel Thompson, who had spent months undermining her credibility, looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. "General Hayes," said Brigadier General Williams, the room's senior officer, after the chairman, "if Lieutenant Colonel Santos is a Medal of Honor recipient, why isn't this reflected in her public service record?" "Because," General Hayes replied, "the operation she participated in involved the rescue of a CIA asset who had penetrated the highest levels of Taliban leadership. Revealing the details would have compromised ongoing intelligence operations and put American lives at risk." She turned back to Maria. "Lieutenant Colonel, with your permission, I'd like to share some of the details that have been recently declassified." Maria nodded, still processing the surreal nature of the moment. For a decade, she'd been unable to explain the gap in her service record, the mysterious promotion that had followed her return from Afghanistan, or the reason why certain senior officers seemed to know more about her capabilities than her official file suggested. March 15, 2014. General Hayes began, her voice taking on the formal tone of an after-action report. "A joint CIA Special Operations mission to extract a high-value intelligence asset went wrong when Taliban forces surrounded our position at a remote compound in Helmand Province." The room was absolutely silent as General Hayes continued. "I was a colonel, then leading the extraction team. We were pinned down by superior numbers with no hope of reinforcement. Our communications were jammed, our extraction helicopter had been shot down, and we were facing imminent capture or death." Maria remembered the desperation of that moment, the realization that 13 American lives hung in the balance, and that she was the only one in position to do something about it. "Captain Santos was attached to our unit as a liaison officer," General Hayes continued. "She wasn't supposed to be in combat, but when our position was overrun, she took command of the defense." "Ma'am," Maria said quietly, "there were others who—" "No," General Hayes interrupted firmly. "There were others who followed your lead, but you were the one who made the impossible decisions. You were the one who called in danger-close airstrikes while enemy forces were literally climbing over our defensive positions." Brigadier General Williams leaned forward. "Danger-close airstrikes. How close?" 50 meters, General Hayes replied. "Captain Santos was calling in 500-pound bombs 50 meters from our position because it was the only way to break the enemy assault. She was willing to risk killing all of us to prevent our capture." The military officers in the room understood the significance of that decision. Calling in airstrikes at such close range required not just courage, but precise tactical knowledge and absolute trust in one's own judgment. "The mission lasted 6 hours," General Hayes continued. "Captain Santos coordinated our defense, managed our ammunition distribution, treated wounded soldiers, and maintained communication with air support, all while under constant enemy fire." Colonel Thompson, who had been silent since the revelation began, finally spoke. "General, if this is true, why has Lieutenant Colonel Santos faced questions about her qualifications? Why have there been suggestions that her promotions were based on diversity considerations rather than merit?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. General Hayes's expression hardened as she realized the full scope of what Maria had endured. "Because," she said, her voice carrying barely controlled anger, "the classification of her heroic actions meant that her true service record was hidden from view. People saw a young Latina officer with rapid promotions and made assumptions based on their own prejudices rather than facts. She looked around the room at the assembled officers. How many of you have questioned Lieutenant Colonel Santos's qualifications? How many of you have assumed that her success was due to affirmative action rather than exceptional performance? The uncomfortable silence that followed was answer enough. I want everyone in this room to understand something. General Hayes continued. Lieutenant Colonel Santos didn't just save my life. She saved the life of a CIA asset whose intelligence prevented 3 major terrorist attacks on American soil. Her actions that day saved hundreds, possibly thousands of American lives. Maria felt the weight of a decade of silence lifting from her shoulders. The whispers, the doubts, the constant need to prove herself, all of it had been based on ignorance of her true service record. Ma'am, she said to General Hayes, I appreciate you sharing this, but I've never wanted special treatment because of what happened in Afghanistan. And you won't get special treatment, General Hayes replied. You'll get the recognition you've always deserved, starting now. The moment of recognition should have been the climax of Maria's story, but it quickly became clear that her revelation as a Medal of Honor recipient would create as many problems as it solved. Within hours of General Hayes's disclosure word had spread throughout the Pentagon, and Maria found herself at the center of a political firestorm she'd never anticipated. Colonel Santos, said Deputy Secretary of Defense Robert Morrison during an emergency meeting that afternoon, we have a situation that requires immediate damage control. Maria sat in Morrison's office alongside General Hayes, feeling like she was being briefed on someone else's crisis. Sir, I'm not sure I understand the problem. The problem, Morrison replied, is that your story is about to become public, and it's going to raise uncomfortable questions about military classification policies, diversity initiatives, and the treatment of minority officers. General Hayes's expression darkened. With respect, Mr. Secretary, the only uncomfortable question should be about why a Medal of Honor recipient has been subjected to discrimination and doubt for 10 years. General, you're missing the bigger picture, Morrison said. If this story breaks, it's going to be spun as evidence that the military has been hiding minority achievements to avoid political controversy. The media will have a field day. Maria felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach. Even her moment of vindication was being viewed through the lens of politics and public relations rather than simple recognition of service and sacrifice. Sir, she said carefully, I never asked for my service to be made public. I've been content to serve without recognition. But that's not an option anymore, Morrison replied. Too many people know the story now. We need to get ahead of this before it becomes a scandal. The irony wasn't lost on Maria. For 10 years, she'd been criticized as a diversity hire, and now the revelation of her true achievements was being treated as a potential public relations disaster because it highlighted the very discrimination she'd faced. What are you suggesting? General Hayes asked, her voice carrying a warning edge. We're suggesting that Colonel Santos consider a transfer to a less visible position, Morrison said. Perhaps a training command or an overseas assignment where the media attention would be minimized. The suggestion hit Maria like a physical blow. After finally receiving recognition for her service, she was being asked to disappear again to avoid political complications. You want to hide her again? General Hayes said, her voice rising with anger. You want to bury her achievements for the second time because acknowledging them might be politically inconvenient. General, we're trying to protect the colonel's career and the military's reputation by perpetuating the same injustice that created this problem in the first place, General Hayes interrupted. Maria stood up, her decision crystallizing with sudden clarity. Mr. Secretary, with respect, I decline your suggestion. Morrison looked surprised. Colonel, you may not understand the full implications. I understand perfectly, Maria said, her voice carrying the same authority that had commanded soldiers under fire in Afghanistan. You're asking me to hide my service record again to protect people who were comfortable discriminating against me when they thought I was just a diversity hire. She looked directly at Morrison. For 10 years, I've endured whispers and doubts about my qualifications. I've watched colleagues question my every decision and assume my promotions were based on politics rather than performance. And now that the truth is out, you want me to disappear again. Colonel Santos, Morrison said, you're not thinking clearly about the political ramifications. The political ramifications are exactly what I'm thinking about, Maria replied. How many other minority officers are facing the same discrimination I faced? How many are being written off as diversity hires when they're actually exceptional performers? General Hayes smiled with obvious pride. Colonel Santos is right. This isn't a crisis to be managed. It's an opportunity to address systemic problems in how we evaluate and promote officers. Morrison's face flushed with frustration. General, if you push this story public, it's going to create a media circus that will overshadow legitimate military operations. Then maybe, General Hayes said, it's time for the military to have an honest conversation about how we treat our people, starting with giving Colonel Santos the recognition she's earned and the respect she deserves. Maria felt a surge of determination that reminded her of that day in Afghanistan when she'd decided to risk everything to save her fellow soldiers. Mr. Secretary, I'm not hiding anymore. If my story helps other officers who are facing discrimination, then it's worth whatever political complications it creates. The battle for recognition was just beginning, but Maria was ready to fight it. The next 72 hours transformed Maria Santos from an unknown Pentagon staff officer into the center of a national conversation about military service recognition and systemic discrimination. Despite the Defense Department's attempts to control the narrative, the story leaked to military blogs and eventually to mainstream media. Hidden hero, Medal of Honor, recipient faced years of discrimination, read the headline in the Washington Post. The article, based on interviews with officers who had witnessed General Hayes' revelation, sparked immediate outrage and support in equal measure. Maria found herself summoned to a meeting with the Secretary of Defense himself, James Patterson, a former Marine general who'd built his reputation on straight talk and military reform. Colonel Santos, Patterson said as she entered his office, you've created quite a stir. Sir, I never intended. I know you didn't, Patterson interrupted, but sometimes the most important changes happen when people don't intend them. Sit down. We need to talk. General Hayes was already present along with several other senior officers that Maria didn't recognize. The atmosphere was tense, but not hostile, more like a war council preparing for a difficult campaign. Colonel, Patterson continued, I've spent the last 3 days reviewing your service record, the real one, including the classified portions. What I've found is both impressive and deeply troubling." He pulled out a thick file. "Your performance evaluations have been consistently outstanding. Your tactical innovations in Afghanistan have been adopted throughout special operations. Your intelligence analysis has influenced major strategic decisions, and yet you've faced constant questions about your qualifications." Maria nodded. "Yes, sir. It's been challenging." "It's been unacceptable," Patterson said firmly, "and it's going to stop. But first, I need to know something. Are you prepared for what's about to happen to your life?" "Sir, Colonel, you're about to become the face of military reform. Every interview request, every speaking engagement, every congressional hearing about diversity and discrimination, they're all going to want you. Your private life is about to become very public." Maria thought about the quiet life she'd built, the careful balance she'd maintained between her public service and personal privacy. "Sir, I just want to serve." "And you will," Patterson replied. "But you're also going to help us fix a system that's been broken for too long." General Hayes leaned forward. "Maria, we've identified 17 other cases similar to yours. Exceptional officers whose achievements were classified or minimized, who faced discrimination based on assumptions about their qualifications. 17. Maria felt sick thinking about other officers enduring what she'd experienced. "Probably more," Patterson said. "We're conducting a comprehensive review of promotion and assignment patterns looking for evidence of systemic bias. Your case was just the most egregious example." The meeting was interrupted by Patterson's aide, who entered with an urgent expression. "Sir, we have a problem. Senator Williams is calling for congressional hearings, and Representative Martinez wants to introduce legislation requiring public disclosure of all Medal of Honor recipients." Patterson sighed. "The political circus is starting earlier than I expected." "Sir, Maria said maybe I should consider that transfer after all. If my presence is creating problems—" "Absolutely not," Patterson said firmly. "Colonel, running away from this fight would send exactly the wrong message. We need to face this head on." He stood and walked to the window overlooking the Pentagon's central courtyard. "Maria, I'm going to ask you to do something that goes beyond normal military service. I want you to become the public face of our reform efforts. I want you to tell your story not just to the media, but to Congress, to military academies, to anyone who will listen." "Sir, I'm not sure I'm qualified for that kind of role." General Hayes smiled. "Maria, you held off an enemy assault for 6 hours while calling in airstrikes on your own position. I think you can handle a few congressional hearings." Patterson turned back to face her. "Colonel, I'm offering you a choice. You can accept a promotion to full colonel and take command of a new office dedicated to military personnel reform. You'll have the resources and authority to investigate discrimination, recommend policy changes, and ensure that what happened to you doesn't happen to others." The offer was staggering. Maria would go from being a staff officer facing discrimination to leading the military's efforts to combat that same discrimination. "What's the alternative?" she asked. "You continue in your current role. We handle the media attention as quietly as possible, and nothing really changes," Patterson said. "The choice is yours." Maria thought about the 17 other officers who'd faced similar discrimination, about the young minority officers who were probably experiencing the same doubts and challenges she'd faced. She thought about the soldiers she'd saved in Afghanistan and the principle that had driven her to risk everything for others. "Sir," she said, "I accept the promotion and the assignment." Patterson smiled for the first time since she'd entered his office. "Outstanding. Your first task will be testifying before Congress next week about your experiences and recommendations for reform." "Next week?" Maria felt a flutter of nervousness. "The political momentum is building quickly," General Hayes explained. "We need to get ahead of it and shape the narrative rather than just responding to it." As the meeting concluded and Maria prepared to leave, Patterson called her back. "Colonel Santos, one more thing. When you testify before Congress, I want you to wear your Medal of Honor." Maria looked surprised. "Sir, I've never worn it publicly." "Then it's time to start," Patterson said. "The American people need to see what a real hero looks like, and they need to understand that heroism comes in many forms." As Maria left the secretary's office, she realized that her life had just changed forever. She was no longer just a staff officer trying to prove herself. She was about to become a symbol of change in an institution that desperately needed it. 1 year later, Colonel Maria Santos stood before a packed auditorium at West Point, addressing the newest class of cadets about leadership service and the courage to stand up for what's right. The Medal of Honor gleamed on her dress uniform, no longer hidden, but worn with the pride of someone who'd earned recognition through service and sacrifice. The Office of Military Personnel Reform that Maria now led had investigated over 200 cases of potential discrimination, resulting in policy changes that transformed how the military evaluated and promoted officers. The Santos Protocols, as they'd become known, required transparent promotion criteria and mandatory bias training for all senior officers. Leadership, Maria told the cadets, isn't just about commanding others. It's about having the courage to be yourself, to serve with integrity, and to fight for those who can't fight for themselves. In the audience, she could see faces that reflected the military's changing demographics, young men and women of all backgrounds who would enter a service that was more fair and equitable because of the changes her story had sparked. The congressional hearings had been difficult but transformative. Maria's testimony about facing discrimination despite her heroic service had led to the Military Recognition and Equity Act, ensuring that classified achievements would be acknowledged through alternative means and that discrimination based on assumptions about diversity hires would be actively combated. General Hayes, now retired, but serving as an advisor to Maria's office, often reminded her that change was a process, not an event. "You didn't just save my life in Afghanistan," she'd told Maria. "You saved the careers of countless officers who will never face what you faced." The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Maria still received criticism from those who believed that addressing discrimination was political correctness rather than military necessity. But she'd learned to weather those storms with the same courage that had carried her through enemy fire. After her speech, a young Latina cadet approached Maria with tears in her eyes. "Ma'am, thank you for showing us that we belong here." Maria smiled, remembering her own doubts as a young officer. "You don't just belong here," she replied. "You're exactly what this institution needs." As Maria left West Point that evening, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from a discriminated staff officer to a symbol of military reform. The whispers of diversity hire had been replaced by recognition of her true achievements, But more importantly, the system itself had changed to ensure that future officers would be judged by their merit, not their demographics. The end.